The current pastor at that time said to me, "Whatever you do, don't talk about money." Fundamentally, stewardship is about exercising our God-given dominion over his creation, reflecting the image of our Creator God in his care, in his responsibility, maintenance, protection, and beatification of his creation. So let's examine this. By a show of hands, who remembers Fred Brooke? Fred was a member here a long time ago. Fred was plagued with many compulsive behaviors. I recall he was a pack rat, to that point that a large metal dumpster was dropped off at his house, and our pastor, along with some other people, came to help and gave Fred the encouragement he needed to fill the dumpster while emptying his house. Fred also was a self-taught scripture revealer. I called him a revealer. Whenever he was scheduled to read the lessons for any given Sunday, he would read them, and then he would talk to you about them for sometimes 5 or 6 minutes, much to the chagrin of the pastor. By a show of hands, how many of you remember Sylvia Chesser? Sylvia was a member here for most of her adult life. She taught math at Columbia High School, raised a large family. At a moment in time that changes your life, Sylvia was involved in an auto accident. Details are easy to visualize. Her car was rear-ended, and when she stepped between the two cars to see what the damage on her car was, a third car hit the car behind her and trapped her between the two cars, crushing her knees and being extremely injured. Sylvia went through surgeries, rehab, and lots of prayers. And when she was ready to return to church, my wife and I offered to give her a ride because she couldn't drive anymore. And I was a little concerned about what it would be like to have Sylvia in our car. I didn't know her that well. And because of her leg, she couldn't bend to get in the back seat, so she sat in the front seat next to me. And I realized in the beginning that whatever it was exactly what it would be. So I got in. Sylvia struggled to get in to her side of the seat. And I said, "So Sylvia, how are things?" And then I would listen for the 15-minute drive to church. No reply was necessary. Sylvia exercised her God-given dominion over me. What are the 4 pillars of stewardship? Prayer, a heart-to-heart with God. Formation, continuous conversion. Service, love in action. Hospitality, Christian kindness. When I was a stranger, you welcomed me. By a show of hands this morning, who remembers Al Lawrenson? 2, 3, 4. Al was a gentle soul. He was about my current age today, early 80s, when I first met him. I have 2 vivid memories of Al. First was at church council meeting, my first council meeting. We were small then and struggling to survive after some pretty serious events that remain in the history of St. Timothy's. Anyway, we were at the council meeting, and for my first time, I heard the treasurer's report. It wasn't about how much the offering had brought in the previous month. The discussion was, by the leadership of the church, do we pay New York Tel or do we pay National Grid? We didn't have money to pay both bills. I don't remember which one we paid, but I sure do remember Al reaching into his pocket and putting on the table a handful of folding money, as it's called. A lot of other people joined him. Now, which bill we paid, I don't know. But it was a huge, huge statement. The second thing that I remember about Al involved Al at the time was probably except for Joyce, was probably our oldest member at the time. And a little girl in her very prettiest Sunday go-to-meeting dress was standing there. Our pastor at that time would play his guitar as our recessional, and it was usually, lively and enjoyable, and the congregation joined in. But while that was going on, if you happened to look to the back of the sanctuary, you would see Al and the little girl holding hands, and Al would be circling with the little girl, dancing, and then they'd dance back and forth, and then back around again. Al was reflecting the image of our God as he showed his love. Okay, by a show of hands, who remembers Phil Lang? One. Oh, good. Those of you who didn't raise your hand, don't feel that it's bad. It's a timing issue. By a show of hands, we know that there are people here this morning that knew Phil. Phil was a man with many challenges and many gifts. Phil was blind when I met him, a condition that had progressed over the years. Phil was a teacher. He taught school in the Glens Falls, Lake George area. And I met Phil and heard his story through the men's group of our church. It seemed that another member, Lester Jeffries, who many of you will remember, had a connection with Phil through his membership at St. Paul's in Rensselaer. Phil told Lester about the conditions under which he was living, and they were not good. The only family he had was a brother in Glens Falls. Neither had the ability to drive. His stay there was his guide dog became impossible when the people renting the upstairs partied so much and so loud he couldn't sleep, and he feared for his life. Lester offered Phil a room at his home, and that's when the men's group took action. A large van was acquired, driven to his house down the steep driveway right up to the back door, and we moved Phil, lock, stock, barrel, and guide dog, to Lester Jeffries' house. This was a difficult transition, hard for a man who, blind, had to find his way around in a whole new situation. He had another transition to deal with. His good friend Lester had a fatal heart attack. So now he was alone. Lester's family allowed Phil to remain in the home, although some of the conditions were changed and a challenge. Now, Phil had no way to travel to church. Since he was close to the way we traveled to church, we agreed to pick him up, and on the way to church, Phil would check in with us by phone on Saturday to confirm we were all going. Phil was a delight to have in the car. Many stories, both happy and sad, were shared over the time that we drove him back and forth. We all walked in church together, sat together and worshiped together like a family. Over time, we discovered that Phil played the clarinet. Now, anybody else remember that? That he played? It was the clarinet, right? Okay, I wasn't sure I had the right instrument. He played the clarinet, and it was a lot of fun to have him play. And one time when we were having one of our evening events that we always provided music for, we asked Phil if he would play. And he did, and played on and on as everything was going on. His face became redder and redder. And he said, I didn't know I was going to be playing this long. And we ended up, I think he played about 40 minutes that time. He was a great guy. So, my wife and I visited Phil in the hospital, or I should say in the pre-op area. He was having open heart surgery. Like Phil, we were suitably quiet when the nurse came to wheel Phil up to surgery. And I leaned down and he told me, "This is so Phil. I'm not worried. I've had a great life, and if this is the end, so be it. If not, I will look forward to more time on God's green earth." Of course, Phil did survive and spent some more years doing what came naturally to him. Phil was an example of one of the 4 pillars of the church, that being prayer. He spoke up at service, praised the Lord, and always thanked the Lord for what he had been given, which always amazed me. And I find that so frequently with people who are challenged. I'm not sure I could handle those challenges, and I'm not too sure I'd be, saying it was okay. In closing, I would like to say that Fred, Sylvia, Al, and Phil represented the 4 pillars of stewardship, and we didn't even discuss money. Thank you for your time this morning.